Hi, I'm Malini. Some years ago, I met a real Indian from India who promptly told me that I had been saying my name wrong all my life. My name is Malini and it's a Sanskrit name, and Sanskrit is an ancient Indian language, so I figured this real Indian from India must know a thing or two about pronouncing my Sanskrit name. You see, I'm only Indian on the outside. Inside, pure Vegemite. I'll get back to that story of my mispronounced name. For now, let me backtrack a little bit. I was raised in a very multicultural environment. We think we have that in Australia, where I live. But in Penang, where I grew up, this was the cultural chaos from which I sprang. I had ethnically Indian parents who didn't speak their mother tongues, and even if they did, they wouldn't have understood each other because they didn't share the same language. Their parents migrated to Singapore from India at the very beginning of the 20th century, when Singapore and India, well, they were like outlying provinces of England. My parents, therefore, being loyal citizens of the British Empire, were brought up speaking the Queen's English. Some parts of their childhood recollections sounded a lot like they grew up in England rather than in Southeast Asia. And I grew up surrounded by Chinese people. Our housekeeper, my best friend, my first boyfriend, all my schoolmates, my favorite food, and just about everyone I knew was Chinese. Even the language other than English that I was most fluent in, but I was too shy to speak, was Hokkien, which is the most commonly used Chinese dialect in Penang. And adding to this complex cultural backdrop was religion. Before I was born, both my parents were from good Methodist families, and they became members of the Baha'i faith. So instead of being taught an Indian language and being encouraged to connect with my cultural heritage, I was taught the oneness of humanity, and I was encouraged to have a world-embracing vision. If they instilled any thought of cultural heritage at all, it was almost irrelevant in the face of all that diversity around us. Because the Malaysia of my childhood was a beautiful, riotous, yet strangely harmonious blend of three racial groups: Malay, Chinese, and Indian, the minority. And back then, the cultures were relaxed. There was fellowship and friendship, and this was particularly evident in sharing of food and festivities. So it really wasn't too hard for me to extrapolate all that ambiguous cultural identity that I had grown up with to something that I thought everyone had. Then I left Malaysia and I went to university in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And cultural identity was about to get very tricky. My first experience of living overseas was a year spent in Suva, Fiji. Now you're thinking, now that sounds idyllic. Sunny beaches, tropical paradise. How cool is that? Well, firstly, it rains a lot in Suva. And secondly, there were no beaches, but I got to study mangrove swamps close up. And thirdly, I was soon to become, at the tender age of 17, a social outcast because I was the only foreign student at the University of the South Pacific. But here's the strangest thing. I looked just like everyone else because I shared the features of 50% of Fiji's population who are ethnically Indian. So before long, it was made clear to me that a young Indian girl, armed only with English, a smattering of Malay, and a perfect comprehension of Hokkien, had absolutely no business calling herself an Indian in Fiji. I had never been among so many Indians in my life, and yet I was a pariah to them. Fortunately, I had no trouble making friends with islanders from everywhere, including the far-flung nations of the Solomons and Samoa and Tonga and Kiribati, so I wasn't lonely. But it was a bit bewildering to someone who had never really been aware of difference. When I arrived in Australia for the very first time a year later, I was 18, and there was something about this place that was so vast and clean and clear, and it made me feel like I could breathe and I could rest. And I know, it's cliched, but it felt like I was coming home. So, how do you say my name? Malini. I say it Malini. That Indian from India said it some other way. I actually don't know how to say it correctly. So you can call me anything you like. I'm Malini, and that was my story. Hi folks, I'm Malini Parker. If you liked my story, there are two things you can do right now to hear more. You can click on this button to subscribe to my channel, and I'll keep telling you stories. You can also head over to my website and sign up for my updates, so you'll get goodness delivered straight to your inbox every month. Just click on the link here. Everything I do and teach is about living a more creative life, and I'd love for you to join me.